Hey everyone, welcome to Sociastrology. Today I wanted to look at the major patterns that we will be experiencing in 2025. This is just a preliminary look. We won't take it through month by month. We'll just be looking at some of the major aspect patterns that we'll be experiencing, which will be quite a few, and take a bit of a look at eclipse season and things like this to get an overall sense of some of the bigger things that we'll be experiencing next year. Now, of course, the biggest thing that is happening in this year is going to be the shift of Neptune and Uranus into new signs. And we will definitely spend some time going through all of that. But there are some other really fascinating patterns that we get, mostly drawing on that because of the fact that the minor grand trine aspect pattern that those planets are forming in their new signs, along with Pluto in Aquarius, are setting us up for some pretty sharp distinctions in the energy based on the patterns that are created off of that through different seasons throughout the year. So I want to look through each of those together and get just an overall sense of how the energy will be shifting and changing throughout the year. So with all of that said, as always, if you are new here, please do consider subscribing for future videos. I would love to have you here. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, I very much appreciate that. It helps to encourage the algorithm to spread this video more, and it helps the channel to grow. So I very much appreciate all of that. And it also indicates to me more of what you would like to see here. So with all of that said, let's dive into it. We'll go through this relatively chronologically, and fortunately that puts our roughest aspect first. So we will be getting through this one relatively early in the year, and then we will be able to, let me turn on the pen here, then we will be able to, move on from this energy of the Mars opposition to Pluto. Now, we will also be experiencing this aspect in Capricorn and Cancer from about here to here, just before the election in 2024. But then as Mars goes retrograde, it will come back into that opposition again. And then as it goes forward, we will see that it comes through once more in April. Now, this is relatively maximally tense. There's a lot of issues of power dynamics, but also the power dynamics aren't really just straightforward when it comes to this. So typically Pluto is going to represent power that is quite exalted. So thinking of some of the most powerful people and institutions globally, nationally, even in personal contexts, it's generally speaking those with the most power in a situation. And what's interesting about that kind of power is that it kind of enables people to exert their influence not only overtly, but also covertly. And that's something that we'll be seeing in this kind of interesting dynamic where Mars is coming in to oppose that Pluto. So it's not just straightforwardly, oh, this is associated with violence. Yes, for sure, and conflict. But what it kind of indicates to us is there's a push and pull. There's two sides to this. There are questions around this of overt versus covert force, working behind the scenes versus being out in the open about one's efforts and one's actions. And some of the things that we can expect to see on the world stage with this dynamic are covert efforts or just force against illegal activities. So Pluto brings in a lot of themes of things that are done in secret. So black markets, illegal activities, things like that, that are kept secret. And there's force here being applied against that. So there could, without a doubt, be crackdowns with this. We have some other transits that will also be indicative of crackdowns throughout the year. But we don't just want to think of this as, say, the FBI coming down on organized crime or something like this. This can go both ways, where force can be applied to those in power who tend to abuse that power. And there can be forceful efforts to address that directly under this influence. So there could also be with this, actions against people who are powerful, including governments. And of course, that can be a little unsettling in the US, where we apparently don't have just a straightforward, peaceful system of inauguration anymore, of course. But additionally, this can be looked at in so many different contexts. So globally speaking, this can absolutely refer to things like covert operations, military somehow, working behind the scenes, standoffs between militaries, and it can be quite cold and calculating, as well as rather callous in the way that one would go about exerting this force. But on a personal level, there is one way that we can kind of utilize this in an interesting way, where this opposition certainly indicates attention. It's not some lighthearted transit that we can take kind of any way we want to, but it does imply a lot of power, and it does imply a lot of power over our actions. So we can utilize this to really focus in on our own force of will. If you are really needing to force yourself to do something, for instance, if you were doing some sort of training for some endurance related physical activity or something like that, this would actually be pretty helpful to that. Now, of course, we would want to be very careful not to overexert ourselves with this kind of transit, but it can give you a tunnel vision kind of focus on a goal to achieve that goal. And it can also convert a huge amount of strength of will to accomplish this. So yes, on the global stage, this is not the kind of transit that we want to be looking at right now. On a personal level, we can certainly utilize this. We can also lean away from some of its worse associations of rashness or reactiveness in our action. But additionally, this can also represent force applied to address a problem of abuse of power. So while we are dealing with this transit, I hope that we can kind of keep that in mind. And hopefully we will see more than not of that side of it, where it can be constructive and not just destructive, because it certainly seems to have the power to be destructive. I have to admit that. But so we'll be experiencing this through the spring. It will fall off a bit as Pluto is in Aquarius, and this moves quite a bit into Cancer. It'll be a little bit out of orb. So we should have a bit of an interim period that's coming up that I think is actually on the next slide here. But otherwise, it will come back around again by the end of April, and then it will phase out. So another thing that has stood out to me about 2025 is that the spring eclipses in particular look relatively pleasant. Now, I will be the first to say that trines and sextiles are not always good. Sometimes they can provide access to things that we would prefer not to be easily accessed, where there's no friction, there's no tension, there's no resistance there. So we do want to look at, for instance, some of the conjunctions also that we will be experiencing with these eclipses. But overall, yeah, sextiles and trines do tend to indicate less conflict or tension than squares and oppositions and so forth. So it does look relatively good. One thing that I do like about this period of time is that we don't really have very many planets that are in detriment or fall other than Mars. So, and then also Jupiter, but Jupiter's usually going to behave relatively fine regardless of its dignities. So the sun is exalted, Venus is exalted, Neptune is at least quite comfortable in Pisces. For the new moon eclipse in Aries, for the full moon eclipse in Virgo here, We do have Venus that is in detriment, but it's about to retrograde back into Pisces where it exalts. So that's not too serious of a concern. Additionally, these oppositions between the moon and these planets that are all pretty tight in Pisces here don't look that terribly concerning to me. They could bring a level of depth of mood, and we could have somewhat weightier concerns on our mind than we would prefer, but it's nothing that is terribly tense. Additionally, you can't have a full moon without an opposition. So it looks quite good to me throughout this whole period of time. We will probably get something a little bit intense and probably not the best of news with the new moon eclipse due to the proximity of Saturn with the North Node here during an eclipse. But altogether, man, this could be so much worse. It looks pretty solid, like a pretty flowing season where we might get a break from some of the more intense transits and dynamics that we've been dealing with recently. So let's look at here the minor grand trine that we will be starting off with. Oh man, I have the dates on the next slide, so we'll get into that in a second. But certainly by the 31st of August, we have this super close and tight together with these outer planets. And Saturn will be with Neptune for the whole year. So we do want to keep that in mind as well. So some of the things that we will be experiencing, certainly off the bat with this and continuing for several years as this aspect pattern maintains between these three planets for at least 3 or 4 years that we'll have this dynamic here, will be the integration of a lot of these new energies. So novel, forward-thinking ideologies and ways of being. So doors opening up into kind of new ways of living. We're going to be getting our first real glimpses of this next year. We've seen a tiny bit of it as Pluto has dipped into Aquarius a couple times since 2023, but 2025 brings all of these planets together in these new signs. And this is something that we haven't experienced before, where we've had ingresses that were all in aspect to each other, creating an enclosed aspect pattern, all within about a year or two of each other and all really ingressing within a few months. So these are going to be changes, ideas, applications, lifestyles, new materials and narratives, socially, culturally, politically, geopolitically, that are going to be coming up for us pretty much all at once in a way that definitely no one living has ever experienced before, but that I haven't seen on this scale whatsoever. And I have looked at pretty much all of the major ingresses of the outer planets for the past 2,000, 2,500 years. We had an interesting thing where almost this kind of thing happened around 500 or so CE, but the ingresses didn't occur all around the same time, and the aspect pattern was nowhere near this close. So it's hard to overstate what a radical shift this represents, and it definitely indicates that we're coming into a completely new era, which will also carry with it a completely new zeitgeist, a new way of experiencing reality. What else this indicates for us starting next year will be definitely major undertakings with technological advancements. This is going to be, again, pretty exponential change that we'll be experiencing. Perhaps this is due to the application of AI on technology, where it is able to develop itself in ways that would take us way too long to do ourselves. And what it will be leading toward is new applications of technology. Now, certainly I could see us getting much deeper into space travel, considering we have the pioneering spirit of Aries here really entering the collective imagination and being grounded into reality, with Saturn and Neptune moving into Aries together here. with a better understanding of technology and how to, I think, more efficiently communicate with it in order to get it to do what we're wanting for it to do without there being too many complicated steps. I mean, if we think about it, almost none of our like applications and programs and ways of doing computing is really ideal, nor is the code really ideal. It tends to be rather clunky. It tends to be caught up in the complication of the way that computers communicate and process versus the way that humans communicate and process. And that's pretty fundamentally different. And so if we can better understand how to connect on that level and how to communicate in a much more efficient way than our current coding allows for us to do, then we can get results which are, of course, exponentially beyond what we're experiencing currently. And that would help immensely with not only space travel, but also space exploration. I'm not the biggest fan of people thinking that we should go and visit Mars when we have so many problems at home, or people who are thinking that we should go and mine all of the materials on other bodies out in space. But I certainly love orbiters and probes and rovers and stuff like that. So anything that can make that easier so that we can at least kind of understand more of what's out there is going to be immensely helpful to those to those efforts. Additionally, with Pluto moving into Aquarius and interacting with both this strong pioneering spirit where we're trying to ground our ideals and our visions into reality here in Aries, and then communicating a lot more efficiently and a lot better with technology and hopefully working together a lot better toward common collective efforts with Uranus moving into Gemini. We also have the implication here of very, very powerful technology, which is going to be focused heavily on those collective efforts and on exploring and achieving things that we haven't been able to so far. So this definitely is a major indication for, again, types of computing that we wouldn't think of right now, but additionally also major advances in our understanding of the universe, generally speaking. Not to mention, this can indicate major informational breakthroughs with regard to physics. And when we start putting all of those pieces together, I mean, the application of those things that's exactly what we need. That's exactly what we're stuck on right now in terms of our ability to innovate. Additionally, all of this really brings in major new ways of relating to each other. It, again, is impossible to overstate how significant these ingresses are for society and culture and how we're going to be viewing ourselves, other people, our interactions, not to mention the ridiculous level of ease with which we're going to be able to communicate with each other with these new technologies. That's going to be a lot of what that's focused on. Additionally, this simultaneous ingress here just really expresses, I think, a huge desire for change that we've been experiencing for a little while now that feels just like so overdue, which I feel like we're generally picking up on is right around the corner. And so not only will we be seeing a lot of these changes, but a lot of the reason for that is simply that that's going to be where our energies are focused, is on creating huge integrated changes within society, globally speaking. Now, all of these placements also indicate individually, but also especially together, a major focus on individualism and freedom. Now, this isn't just straightforwardly singular or self-serving in its individualism. These are also very collective energies, but they are collectively individualistic in the sense that, for the most part with these, the idea is that space should be held for people to be able to express themselves the way that they do, for them to be able to live more in accordance with the way that they want to live, and to have the freedom and also just the comfort and sense of freedom to do that. So that's another major effort that we're going to be seeing under this transit, is pushes toward that. Additionally, you know, it's hard to look at a pattern like this and, it's, I guess, a bit like what is it, the watchmaker kind of dilemma, where, man, it looks like it's by design, and it's weird in that way. I always to and fro a bit on that concept, but it looks to me like there is, at the very least, a major omen that things need to change, that we need to innovate, that we need to push forward, that we need to get out of the stuck energies that we've been in for millennia at this point, where sure, there's been developments around the edges, but ultimately what we're still dealing with is massive inequality, abusive class systems, borders defining quality of life, and so on and so forth. So all of these concepts that we've been struggling with for millennia, it's being laid quite bare in 2025 and going forward, that this needs to change. And additionally, it looks like the kind of thing where, rip anyone who is going to try and prevent that or get in the way of that, because it's not going to work. I mean, this is the kind of thing where if you're going to try and resist change under this, you'll definitely wind up failing with that. And additionally, this is the kind of thing where if again you try and resist changes like this, that's where you start to get the wrath of Pluto, when you're not doing what it is that a rather healthy and satisfied Pluto, where things are not outdated, they're not inefficient, they're not abusive or in need of major renewal. Under those circumstances, Pluto's pretty fine and it's pretty okay. But if those are the case, that's when Pluto comes in and knocks things around. So I would certainly not want to be anyone in society, especially anyone with power and things to lose, to try and get in the way of this kind of situation, because I don't think it's going to go over very well. So we'll look a little bit at each of these in turn. Pluto has moved permanently into Aquarius as of November 20th of 2024. So when I'm recording this, we still have it in Capricorn, but it will switch in permanently before the end of the year. But I do want to cover it a little bit more as well and get a little bit more context around this minor grand trine as it moves into these new signs. So with Pluto in Aquarius, there are going to be issues around the power of big tech, and certainly could be crises around this. Now, I'm not saying that big tech is going to be destroyed and taken out and so on and so forth. In fact, technology is going to be the basis of a lot of power, unfortunately. In some of its worst excesses, yeah, there would be crises that arise around that, but that power will grow. And coming out of Capricorn, again, think about this like what we've experienced with status quo entrenched institutions, banks, governments, major corporations, and so forth over the past 16 years or so. They've gone through huge periods of intense crisis that have brought a lot of those to their knees. But that power is not gone. Now, that power will probably continue to slip from those things, or they're going to have to radically change in the coming 19 years or so that we will have Pluto in Aquarius. But that power is something that we're going to have to contend with. So we will want to keep it in mind. Again, it's been an ongoing issue around privacy and the influence that media has on our well-being and so on and so forth. These issues will continue to arise, and they'll probably be a little bit more important to continually push against, to try and get that aspect of this to be as little of a problem as possible. So we will really want to keep in mind that, yeah, big tech is going to be doing some impressive, interesting things, but do keep in mind that your privacy does still matter. So we will need to push back against some excesses when it comes to that. Additionally, the power of the intelligentsia, I have written here. This is like the intellectual workers, the mental workers. So, you know, it's funny the way that a lot of people are conceptualizing AI is that it's going to do all of our thinking for us, but it's not, because it can't and probably will never be capable of thinking like a human. Like I was saying with Uranus and Gemini, it doesn't think like we do. It doesn't process like we do. And it doesn't communicate really, even like we do. It copies us, but it's not expressing original critical ideas where it's taking into consideration the emotional and sentimental and fear-based and excitement-based attitudes that we have around morality and critical thinking and things like this. So it doesn't do that. And these are some of the areas where we will continue to see a lot of power and influence in terms of fields and classes of people. So likely an increase in media classes, media related classes, as well as research, people who produce information and things like this, which are based on critical thinking and therefore are also to some extent based in persuasion. We'll see an increase in their status and power in the coming years. And again, this has pluses and minuses, and it's something that we will definitely want to keep in mind, to not have that come at the expense rather of other classes of workers and people generally speaking. So again, transformation of society and affiliations in Aquarius here with Pluto. Definitely, revolutionary narratives around what we need to have changed with regard to power and governmental structures, how we are governed, how we govern ourselves, so to say, how we interact between countries. There will probably be some big questions that come up around global governance during this whole period of time, as Aquarius is highly focused on the entirety of the social sphere. So, I mean, this came to me the other day where, I was just a little bit blown away at just how little power the UN has. And, the fact that when smaller countries go to war with each other and a lot of the, more powerful states are not wanting for that to happen, then it's generally pretty easy to have these institutions, the ICC and so on and so forth. Of course, there's definitely a major bias with regard to who they're actually able to arrest and try. And there's all sorts of power games with regard to that. And just the fact that, if we had another situation like we had in the 30s and 40s, so to say, quote unquote, hypothetically, what power would the UN and the ICC and the ICJ have to address that? It's a critical question because on the other hand, of course, the idea of world governance and the idea of an international body being able to step in does raise weird questions about sovereignty and things like this. And so I think that that's something that we're going to be struggling with a lot in the coming years. And I would not be surprised remotely. I actually really feel, especially given the transits to Israel's chart that's coming up, for the situation that we're seeing unfold with them currently, to cause people, populations, governments internationally, but also those international bodies of, the UN and the various courts and so forth, for them to really understand that this is actually a pretty dangerous game that we're playing, where these, mind-blowingly, maximally horrible things are able to occur, where UN workers are even able to be targeted, though no one should, really, regardless. But certainly, especially, it's so clear when it comes to UN workers. And then what is the UN capable of doing with regard to that? These questions are really going to be coming up. And I think that what we see unfolding right now is going to be a huge part of feeding into questions and answers about what do we need to change in terms of international governance in order to prevent these issues from arising on these extreme levels. And of course, that is in and of itself a major question that we had to ask in the 40s last time when we had Uranus in Gemini. So this is going to be something that's coming up quite sharply. It's already been precipitated again by Uranus and Taurus, which Uranus and Taurus seemingly always does. And so I would not be surprised at all to see just huge changes within the UN. And I understand that that can be a little bit frightening because we do have, major questions of sovereignty. But the more powerful that humanity gets, I think it's going to be really important to explore and address how we can engage with that in a safer way, where there are more safeguards to make sure that that doesn't get completely out of control and out of hand. And I think that that is where a lot of this is going to center. Now, we will probably, I'll get into it more in a moment, but probably a lot of questions around class will also be coming up with this alignment here as well. Now, again, along similar lines of pretty much everything I've been speaking to recently, is we will definitely be dealing with a lot of reaction to this. Fear of change, fear of technology, fear of global governance, things like this. It is reactionary when you're definitely throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's things that definitely need to change, and there's going to be pluses and minuses along the way, but ultimately, I think that the most important way, or maybe one of the better ways for us to engage with that, if we do have those kinds of reactions, is to try to engage with it and try to contribute to the ideas of how to sort out the 21st century problems that we've been trying to address with not even really 20th century solutions, but much, much longer ago than that. Those who reject this out of hand, they're not going to have a lot of input on how it goes. So something to kind of keep in mind. Now, additionally, Pluto, as I mentioned a moment ago, it does indicate on some level crimes, and especially crimes that are going on, of course, under the radar. And so that is going to be more along the lines of networks, computers, hacking, sabotage, scamming, and tech-related crime, as well as warfare over networks. So disconnecting networks that are critical and things like that will almost certainly be an issue that we're dealing with across various countries, but also by, say, non-state actors who are trying to, transfer funds and things like this. Those kinds of things will definitely be occurring on the network more and more. Now, additionally, with Pluto and Aquarius, we will almost certainly be dealing with issues of electricity and connectivity, which are similar to this, but it won't just be sabotage. It's going to be a question of, for some countries, generating enough electricity for all of the networked devices that we're needing to run. Questions around batteries and lithium and so on and so forth, generating electricity and having grids that are powerful enough for us to be able to handle the loads that are going to be demanded. So Neptune is moving into Aries on the 30th of March. It'll stay there until the 22nd of October, but then it will return permanently. This should say 2026. Boop. Yeah, the 26th of January of 2026, it will move in there permanently. So this is actually the day after the Aries eclipse. We'll be having Neptune, which has been involved in a lot of the recent eclipses. It'll be involved with the Virgo eclipse that we have on the 14th of March. And it was also close to the Pisces eclipse that we experienced on the 17th of September of 2024. So that's pretty fascinating because we're going to have that Aries eclipse and then Neptune move right into Aries. So of course, Aries is really all about pioneering and frontiers. There's a lot of that energy whenever Neptune moves into Aries. But Neptune in Aries does some things that are quite interesting and might not be 100% expected, which is, we had a major spiritualist movement arise within, the kind of fringes of Christianity during the last Neptune in Aries period of time. We're also really confronted with our attitudes toward violence and war and victimhood, as well as questions of personal freedom and collective efforts towards goals that come up under Neptune in Aries. Now, this is another reason why I think that space exploration is going to be a pretty huge thing in the coming years, is that with the kind of pioneering and frontier aspect of Aries coming into our collective culture here, this Neptune is going to be very likely to start exploring, other worlds and so on and so forth. I think that I heard that NASA is planning to send people to Mars. We'll see if this happens. That's still super difficult, but again, the way that we solve that is through making our computing ability just immensely more powerful and more efficient. So sending men to Mars by 2030 was their idea, and that would be under Neptune in Aries. So certainly I would expect to see major efforts in that direction. Now, additionally, we can see some major headstrong ideologies arise and also to spread during Neptune in Aries. So any sort of evangelism, I don't just mean Christian evangelism, thank God, but all sorts of pushing one's own beliefs broadly and attempting to influence others to convince them. There's a major effort. I don't know if it's going to be effective or successful to convince others to join various groups and so forth. And that'll be a theme that we see play out throughout this period of time as well. And this could result in some cults of personality. People making groups out to look like they are collectivist and equal and so on and so forth, but really they are centered around particular individuals. So I will always say, be very careful about that. None of us should have any idols on this earth, is my view on that, because it's too dangerous, and anyone who is really worth idolizing isn't going to beg you to do so or really try and persuade you to do so. So just kind of something to keep in mind there. Additionally, we will likely see some serious vigilantism with this. So people deciding to take matters into their own hands. And this is going to be on all sides. So also worth keeping in mind, if you are with one side versus another, which I think, most of us are in some way or another, that the cultural norms and the social, political, legal norms that we establish around the vigilantism of some groups would also apply to others. So try not to be making rules that, one would not want applied to others as well, or would want applied to oneself either, because that's definitely going to be playing out on all sides. Additionally, major questions around masculinity coming up, and it's not going to be all good or all bad. I think it'll be both extremes, and then we'll see what else. But Neptune is going to be calling masculinity big time into question, and some people are going to react really hard to that in a way that could be pretty unsettling. It's interesting that this is coming into force, just after possibly the US would have its first female president. And I'm quite sure that people are not going to all react very well to that. But I think that we're going to see progress made with regard to this, but then also certainly no holds barred when it comes to backlash, and pretty probably quite rough backlash, including potentially some vigilantism. So um, ultimately, by the end of the transit, hopefully it's a lot better. But, it's not just going to be straightforward progress on that front. I will say that. But these two together, Uranus and Gemini, is also really interested in equality. It always brings greater equality by the end of its transit. And with Neptune kind of calling into question some of these gender norms, and especially the way that we kind of box men in, and that some of them also tend to box themselves in, also combined with huge questions around collective power and things like this within society, I think we're going to be making a huge amount of progress ultimately when it comes to gender and the narrative that we have around that, culturally speaking. So we could also see a lot of cultural disorientation in 2025. Now, of course, these transits play out over time where we kind of get used to them and so on and so forth. The culture changes and then we're kind of in that mode. But this is a sharp shift in terms of our culture, especially Pisces to Aries is one of the sharpest shifts that you can get. And so I would not be surprised if there's going to be some definite disorientation in all sorts of ways. So things that are just really like, what, why, that come up, especially with like, Gen Alpha and maybe even Zoomers, although I feel like they've kind of established themselves to some extent at this point, that's just really confusing and disorienting because they're coming up in a time where we're having this major shift here, and it's probably going to be a little bit disorienting to them. So I would not worry so much about the worst aspects that we see immediately. Could be a bit of, say, like cultural whiplash that we're experiencing in the first years of this. Not to mention, there's definitely just going to be some major questioning around norms here with this shift. So as people kind of learn about new norms and things like this, it sounds a little bit too close to comfort for the quote new normal. Again, engagement with what's acceptable and what's not is certainly much better than, say, dismissing or alienating an entire generation of kids just because, some of the more vocal among them are maybe doing some weird stuff that we don't find culturally acceptable. And I wouldn't expect for them to completely fall into the initial what's going to look like a pattern that we see in the first, say, year or two of this. Additionally, there could be some weird violence built into that, we could see some new weird expressions of violence that are probably quite distasteful that arise, certainly in subcultures. I mean, we should also keep in mind that, yes, we had during the U.S. Civil War, to take a bit of a U.S.-centric view again, real quick, we had this during the Civil War, and we also had Uranus in Gemini, and the win was good. The outcome was good of the war. And Reconstruction was in my opinion, absolutely wonderful time. But Reconstruction also was fought against hard. And additionally, this was the period of time where we saw the rise of supremacist groups in the US that started working behind the scenes. So this can also be potentially violent subcultures that are very distasteful, but that operate outside of those norms. Now, lastly on this, with Saturn and Neptune in conjunction, I'm sure you will hear many people point out, as it kind of should be pointed out, that for the past 150 plus years, this is strongly correlated with important periods of time in Russian history, as well as the history of communism. And we can kind of see to an extent why that would be. Neptune is very universalizing. Some astrologers even straight up associate Neptune with communism because it was discovered around the time that started really coming into form in the 1840s and so forth. Similarly, why Pluto is often associated with fascism and Uranus with liberalism, because these ideologies arose around the time that we discovered these planets. And there's, of course, something interesting to that. In fact, I should point out that certainly my generation, I was born in 89, where this is the same cycle that Saturn and Neptune were in. They were exactly conjunct. And Uranus was also very close to them, all in Capricorn. And our little generation group, everyone that I meet that's my age, have pretty strong critiques of capitalism. Now, the extent to which one would take that is personal and open to question. And not everyone that, was born in our years really even thinks about these things very much. But these will definitely be questions of how universally are our structures functioning? Who do they serve, and who are they leaving behind? Neptune with Saturn is going to question the heck out of it. It's really going to ask major questions around the morality of structures, the rightness of structures for those excluded from it. It's not going to be Neptune and Saturn all that comfortable with the idea that it's right or okay to have, say, underclasses and things like this. So we also saw this with decolonization. This was a major theme that came up around that. The fall of the wall, with the USSR reaching a point where the extent to which it served the population versus exploited the population came into major question. And of course, during the Russian Revolution and so on and so forth, these questions come up, and they're going to come up for us again. And, when I use this word, there's whole gradients that go along with this, and ultimately what this really is asking, how empathetically moral is the structure? Is it serving the least among it, or is it not? Is it stepping on them? Is it, forcing them into the position of some kind of underclass? That's what this is going to take issue with. So those questions are really going to be coming up for us globally throughout this period of time. So this word is going to get bandied about quite a bit for anyone who wants to solve the problems that are inherent to the structure. And it's going to be bandied about by those who are served best by our structures, and their sycophants who think that they themselves will somehow one day achieve that. So I would really scrutinize any use of this word when it comes to simple policy proposals and things like that. We actually just saw this as Neptune is on the cusp here of Aries, where I forget who the interviewer was, but Governor Walz was questioned because in the States, at least, where the term socialism is unbelievably misunderstood, and most political terms are misused in this country anyway. He said at one point, that one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. And yeah, because it's a gradient. The whole thing is a gradient. Do we want to do collective action around anything? Then that's more along the gradient than not doing that and just being, this kind of no holds barred, unfettered, capitalism that would be at the other end of that. And she essentially accused him of just full on advocating for, this, although she used the S word, here instead. And yeah, no, he had to explain, look, do we have roads? Do we have schools? There are collective works that we need to do, healthcare systems that work super well in other countries. And some people, call that socialism. Some people are going to be, calling it communism. And I would say just definitely take this term with a grain of salt, and I would certainly recommend, pushing back against those kinds of things. Certainly, terms being bandied about in order to not interrupt the unfettered access to power and wealth of those who are served best by our system. Let me put it that way. So, as far as Uranus in Gemini goes, it will be first moving in on the 7th of July, and it'll hold there until the 8th of November. I think that's about 8th of November, 22nd of October. So, that's like 2 weeks, a little over 2 weeks or something apart, that they'll be both then moving back into their old signs of Pisces and Taurus. And it will, geez, I did it again, of course. Apparently, 2026 is a difficult concept for me. It'll move permanently in on the 26th of April, 2026, whereas it's the 26th of January of the other one. So, yeah, this is really all about new ways of relating. Gemini is 100%, it's all about exchange of all kinds. So, there is a huge extent to which Gemini also has major affiliations with banking and business and trade, with borders, language, media, all of this. So Uranus brings things that are new, major new ways of doing things. Just to give a quick little recap, we've had it in Taurus since 2018, and just look at how much work has changed since then. Also, think of like the whole beyond, it's not even, what is it, cottage core is like this whole new thing that I think a lot of people really can relate to, of just kind of wanting to move out into the country and, get away from the city and so forth. Now, we're probably going to see a pretty big change as far as that goes. Maybe some fun little rural cottages will be a lot cheaper than they were a couple of years ago, hopefully. But as it moves into Gemini, of course, yeah, much more urbane, much more focused on wanting to be in that milieu that Uranus has been trying to avoid as it's been in Taurus, and working from home and moving out into the country and so on and so forth. But there's also disruptions implied when it comes to Uranus. So we will, of course, see those disruptions of connections. We may see networks fall in weird ways. Again, it's probably going to be a volume issue, attacks, things like that. Potential sabotage, hacking, and things like this would also be Uranus within the, communicative structures that we have. Additionally, localities. So probably cities are going to, like municipalities, will likely struggle with some of the new developments that we're going to be experiencing around, for instance, traffic. So think about like self-driving cars. That would be a very Uranus in Gemini thing. And some of the problems that they're causing are for these localities. For one thing, a lot of cities don't want them anywhere near them because they cause a lot of problems. But just like honking in the middle of the night, like a bunch of them in, I think it's San Francisco, has a problem with that. Causing wrecks, not understanding how to deal with each other and with traffic, not understanding that they need to pull over if there's a siren anywhere near them, things like this. Those kinds of disruptions are very likely to occur. But additionally, there could even be issues around zoning. We could see issues where commerce and trade is disrupted or breaks down. Additionally, questions of borders, and that'll probably go both ways, where we may see some pretty ugly actions in response to immigration, but of course, continued sporadic, but what is conceived of as intense migration patterns that we'll be seeing globally as people move into and out of different localities and across borders. Additionally, with Uranus in Gemini, I think we're going to see people feel somewhat more unfettered. This whole work from home thing has definitely encouraged, to some extent, digital nomadism, but it's a pain. It's a huge pain, because only some countries will really want to let you in to do something like that. You have to maintain a certain amount of money, basically. Some will let you pay them in order to be there. But in a lot of countries, you can't just go and live somewhere and work from there you have to have like a reason for having to live there. I used to be on a work visa in Germany, and it's a pain. You have to prove that you are a person that specific people who have to, offer you specific work need, and they can't replace you with someone who's native, So I think that we're going to see a lot of those kinds of rules relaxing because of the fact that there's certainly not really much reason other than raising rents by gentrifying poorer countries with digital workers who then want to come in and say have people speak another language and you know rent apartments there and so on and so forth, driving prices up. As far as the economy goes, if you're not considering the ill effects, if you're looking at it from a national perspective, if you could get people paying taxes that possibly don't have full access to even your social programs and things like that, yeah, that's a good exchange on a national level. So I think that we're going to be seeing a reworking of some of those rules as well. But again, when it comes to the general novelty that we'll be experiencing with this, new ways of communicating with each other, again, probably not just word and sight, but somehow more senses involved with our ability to communicate globally. How we could wind up producing some cool communication networks that work at an insane distance. Like I know that some of the probes and orbiters have continued to send us information as they're getting beyond Pluto, but at a certain point they just can't communicate with us anymore, and so maybe we can extend that range a lot. That would be really excellent, or interesting. At least it might have ill effects, but in the meantime it'll be entertaining. And then new ways of exchanging. So sad to say, I mean, Uranus in Gemini looks like a lot of digital currency kind of stuff. So, if you're not super in favor of that, again, get your ideas, expressed and say what you will about that. I think sadly though, it might be a little bit futile. I think that's pretty much coming. New social dynamics. I think new social classes certainly will be arising within this context. Additionally, like I think new ways of looking at each other. The generations that are coming up, they're really, some of them are still stuck in the past because of the way that they've been brought up or whatnot. But the old social and cultural cues and dynamics and things like this, even along class lines, they just don't hold as much with younger people. And I think that we will see some of the benefits of that play out during this period of time as well, and continue to update our ways of dealing with each other and perceiving of each other and ourselves. New interfaces, I kind of touched on that with the communication of probably not just words and ideas and things like that, but other senses involved with communication and with the interfaces. New ways of learning. Sad to say, I think that the whole, plug-in matrix thing where you just learn stuff real quick is probably still a ways off, but, certainly new methods, not only of learning, but also of education and certification along those lines. That's one thing that we've seen fall behind our new way of looking at education that we've even developed up to this point, is that there's still very little accredited certification that is received by people who do receive their education through alternative means outside of established universities and so forth. Also, new ways of relating in terms of language. I think that language barriers are going to get a lot easier to deal with. We will probably just have instant translation and just be able to speak to each other in whichever language and understand each other in, whichever language. And I think that that's going to be just so excellent. And again, Uranus is a little bit easier to deal with in terms of what to expect, because we're able to look at modern history with several of these transits through Gemini. And there's always big events that precipitate greater equality, good, decent stuff for us. But another thing that I will point out is that the north node of Uranus is currently, I want to say it's around 11 degrees. And I think that, we've seen some really sharp moments in history. The planetary nodes don't move quickly at all. So that node has been there for a very long time. And I think that part of the reason that Uranus and Gemini has stood out as so historically important in recent years is because that planetary node is there, not because the US and then all of the countries that were formed in this last Uranus in Gemini were formed during that time. I don't think it's just the Uranus return thing. I think it's that Uranus is moving toward its node. And that really fascinates me. And it's something that I plan to dig into a little more in the coming weeks and years. So I'll continue to try and touch on that because I really think that there's something to that. Now, moving on from just the minor grand trine in and of itself, that one's over here. Moving on from just this formation, this is what I mean by there's going to be different periods of time throughout this year that are going to be distinctive in particular ways because of the fact that all of these outer planets are all in this position. As the inner planets move to certain angles with regard to these, they're going to be integrating all of that energy also with those inner planets that are going to give specific flavors to different parts of the year. And this is a pattern that we will see continue, not this one in particular because it's Mars, but I'll explain a little bit further. Some of these patterns are going to be holding for a few years, where there's going to be analogous like periods of time that are relatively discrete in their energy. So let's go through some of these. So one thing that we are going to notice is that during Leo season and also during Sagittarius season in years in the future, that'll become more clear in a few slides as well. We're going to have this aspect pattern. I'm terrible with this thing, but I'm going to try to isolate it here. So this pattern, this basket, or some people call it a cradle, this aspect pattern here is going to arise in Leo season as the personal planets move through this early part of Leo. And then as we get into later and later years to come, it'll get a little bit more into Leo that the personal planets go when it creates this aspect pattern. Now, this aspect pattern is interesting because it's then balancing the fire and air that is implied by this minor grand trine, which is more air than fire. And with Leo, what we are introducing to the dynamic is, of course, a little bit more of a sense of the individual and how the individual relates to society, what impact you can have, your own influence. This is a very like quote unquote influencer kind of energy when it comes to this, but it's of course not just limited to that kind of global influence, but also the impact that individuals personally can have on their communities and therefore by extension on the society in which they live. It also will introduce a lot of questions and answers around one's own place in society and how one relates socially and how one sees themselves within the social dynamics that they engage in and encounter in the world. Now, that's going to happen every Leo season, every time a planet moves through this early point in Leo here. But I also wanted to point out, this is an aspect pattern of a castle, is what this is called. And it's where you take that basket and you have also another basket. So there's one here too. And it's basically just building sextile after sextile after sextile. So I wanted to point this out in particular. This is during the Aquarius full moon as well. So we can see that the full moon is running across here. We have Mercury early in Leo, and then all of these things are in contact with Mars as well, which is in Libra. And rather than being opposed to Pluto, it's now in opposition to Saturn and Neptune here. So this full moon definitely stands out to me, this period of time where the planets are moving through these early degrees as Mars is still in the early degrees of Libra. And this looks to me like a breakthrough where we have this grand trine between Uranus, Mars, and Pluto, all in air signs. That's a lot of concentrated effort and concentrated power, which is somehow intellectual in nature. And this is of a lot of really strong consequence. So I would expect to be seeing during around this time of early August for there to be some kind of major consequential breakthrough made, probably along the lines of major social questions. Of course, we have an Aquarius full moon, emphasizing the Aquarian nature of this. And what's interesting here is that, as I was saying with Mars in opposition to Pluto, that Mars is also acting on Pluto, and they're different. And so there could be parties that are taking efforts against, power, high power, extreme power, and also potentially abusive power, especially in that last degree of Capricorn. But with that Mars in opposition to the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, there's something about authority here and something about the image of authority and the influence and coerciveness of authority, generally speaking. And there's this opposition from Mars, which is acting forcefully on behalf of some concept of others, of fair play, of balance in Libra here. And of course, with the balance between the air and the fire with this, we have both words and action. So there will probably be a lot of conversation around whatever is happening here, a lot of different avenues of input. And what I really like about this is that we have Venus and Jupiter here on their own. They're not an aspect to anything else, really. They have minor aspects to the sun and to the moon. But generally speaking, they're not super involved in whatever this is. And this looks really lighthearted and caring to me. Jupiter exalts in Cancer. Venus is perfectly fine to be here. So it looks to me like there's some sort of interesting breakthrough here, which is probably good news. And it's also just kind of weird to me that additionally, because this is all early degrees, early, they're not in contact with these middle degrees, nor with even the late degrees of Chiron here, except by out of sign aspect. And so the full moon is kind of standalone too. So there's three different areas here that are kind of doing their own thing, and yet they seem to be playing into some greater events of major consequence. And it looks like it's pretty good. It looks pretty okay. I don't see really any major warning signs here. There's additionally with the opposition between Mercury and Pluto here, with both of them in retrograde, there's some sort of conversation about how power has been used and a reassessment of it and a revision. So it looks to me like this is also pretty solid. There's conflict in it, but it looks to me like it's productive. And so I really like this Aquarius full moon that we will be having. Additionally, during Virgo season, we'll be having Yods. And I know that I just said on the previous thing here that, these are minor aspects. When they're standalone like this, I'm not, the most inclined to utilize minor aspects, just because I feel like the other aspects tell enough of a story. But when they start making aspect patterns like this, I definitely want to take them into consideration. And when we have early degrees of Virgo, what we'll have is a Yod from Pluto and Saturn and Neptune. And that's a little intense. It's interesting. It's a lot of almost like interrogation between Saturn and Pluto here. And then additionally, some confusion and possibly even covertness or like behind the scenes something with authority. And it'll always be pointing at the planets as they come through here, the early degrees of Virgo. And so with a Yod, this is considered the quote finger of God aspect, and it points at, in a very uncomfortable way, some other point of the chart that is opposite to the center of a sextile. So it's sextile between these and then two quincunx aspects. And the issue is that, again, there's a consequential nature to it, or an awareness of a potential of consequence. And there's a need to adjust and kind of integrate the energies that are relatively uncomfortable. Now, this does indicate like a selection, like pointing to something. And in particular, with this new moon in Virgo, which I didn't mark as a new moon in Virgo, I should have. I think I did on the next page, but this looks like something about like representation. You know, often these Yods can point to you out of a group need to somehow represent the group. You need to bring something or process something for others, and that's where that consequence comes in, right? So there could be some conference of authority. There could be some selection process that goes on under this, and it would be worth looking at that closely and following it during that period of time, because there's something interesting and weird going on with it. But additionally, this could be crackdowns, where we also have a square from Uranus. So all of the outer planets, when they're going through this early part of Virgo, there's a lot of bit of scrutiny here. And that's why it was like between these two, it's like an interrogation. There's a lot of scrutiny. And there could be even traps set. So I would so not be surprised to hear about crackdowns and people caught with things. But additionally, what's interesting here is that with all of these hard aspects too, if you look at it from the point of view of the sun and the moon here, it's kind of in a blind spot, weirdly, as well, because this is considered in traditional astrology to not be an aspect and therefore to not be visible to these planets. So there could also be strange escapes from punishment and authority during this period of time. And it's just so weird to me because I don't know at all what it is. I mean, this is like almost a year away, but it looks pretty sharply like something along those lines. And again, there could be like a need for a weird response to something. It's an unfamiliar situation and we need to adjust to it and respond to it in some specific way, but we don't quite know how to do that because maybe we haven't had to do it before, is a lot of the energy with that. And there could also be alliances that are somehow uncomfortable or that seem a little bit weird. I mean, if you think about like with World War II and the Allies, there were parties involved that were previously not comfortable with each other, but they had to come together to address a specific situation. Now, additionally, this year we have 2 Virgo new moons. And again, I have to point out that it stands out to me that in the coming years, as we have the nodal axis moving into Pisces and Virgo, that, and I'm sorry that there's not much else going on in this chart that is super interesting to these, so I just kind of shut them off so that this would be very clear. But this has a lot going on. All of it is interesting, so we'll talk about this in turn. But this time that we have the North Node in Pisces, we will not have any solar eclipses in Pisces. The solar eclipses that happen in the spring will always be in Aries or Aquarius. And it's very weird. I've never seen anything like that before. And it seems to indicate something along the lines of that we don't need, there's not something to be picked up with regard to Pisces, that energy is somehow okay. It's just that there needs to be something released around it, since we will be having lunar eclipses in Pisces. So it's almost like we need more work than usual along the Aries Aquarius lines, less work around the Pisces lines, but there is stuff that needs to be released around Pisces kind of energy in the coming years. Now, the fact that that's occurring is interesting. The fact that we have 2 Virgo new moons next year also really points to the other side of the equation here, which is Virgo. So huge indications of new starts being very necessary around Virgo season. I mean, if we look at this on the 21st of September, this node is only around 17. It would have been around the same here. So this is missing a double Virgo new moon eclipse for the season by about 2 degrees. So there's a lot of work that is being pointed to that needs to be done along Virgoan themes. And so I went back to some like kind of traditional affiliations of Virgo of like, okay, what do we need to be working on then? And it did stand out to me that Virgo is associated with Jerusalem, I think for relatively obvious reasons. So I've just put that there. But aside from that, there's a lot of problems with our environment. And there's a lot of problems with our health where we've been going really wrong recently. I'm sure that everyone knows, with all of the processed stuff that's really delicious, and I love all of it, but I also love good food, you know. So questions probably around health systems, the environment, not to mention questions around the arrogance of people that does seem also to have arisen in recent years, where it seems like everyone I talk to agrees that it seems like the traits associated with narcissistic personality styles and along those lines seem to be really pronounced in recent years. 2 new moons in Virgo would definitely indicate like, hey, address that. Go more Virgo with that, you know, have some modesty. Consider the fact that you're not the only one in this world, and the world doesn't revolve around you, you know. So I think that major questions are going to be coming up around these themes, probably also around, you know, women's bodies and things like this. I know that's becoming an issue in a lot of countries, and I think that this can definitely indicate that there's going to be some sort of effort to address that. But really, Virgo has to do with things holistically. It's generally, as a sign, going to be pretty annoyed if any of the aspects of something are out of whack. You know, it's not going to brush over the fact that, well, you know, like 80% of it is good, but we're just going to sweep the rest of this under the rug. Like, no, it's going to unsweep that from the rug and address it and deal with it, you know, and try to get to some complete vision of something that's healthy, a society that's healthy. And with new moons, these are changes that are coming in. It's a fresh new start. And so I think there's a lot of indications around that during this period of time. Certainly wonderful things to focus on during this season on a personal level, but I think we'll see this play out on the world stage that way as well. Now, this is a trip. This chart has been standing out to me for a little while, and usually you don't get unique, weird aspect patterns like this that all fold together into one. You know, we have Jupiter is the only one that's messing this up, and I think we can forgive it. But this is just a total trip. Every aspect of this is feeding into the whole pattern. And there's also such a dynamic tension involved here. We have 4 Yods in this, which is, relatively unheard of. This doesn't happen often. You have to get the planets really close together to be hitting the orbs of quincunxes. And so there's a really tight alignment here all around 1 degree through 28 degrees, all really close and bound up like that, 2 degrees really. And so when we look at, what's being focused on here, we have the sun and the moon are in opposition to most closely Saturn, and then also out of sign, we have Neptune. So again, probably questions around authority arising. We also have Mars and Venus also pointing the finger at these two. Questions around the influence of authority, how that's utilized. And then we have a lot of authoritative power and influence really pointing at Venus. And then we have this question of structural change, influence, who has power over that, who has a say in that, what the culture, rather than just never necessarily governments, are saying about the changes that are being probably pushed for with Mars as well, and leading to some sort of action undertaken by this Mars. So there's just so much bound up with this. We have a little bit of difficulty seeing this clearly with the opposition between Mercury and Neptune. We have a tension around the use of force with the square between Mars and Pluto here. And then we also have questions of the way that we relate with other people. There could definitely be gendered questions along with this as well, but certainly the way that we relate with others, and that needing to change with the square between Uranus and Venus on the other side of this. And then we just have Jupiter here. And it's not really doing a crazy amount. I mean, even this sextile or this trine to Saturn is pretty wide. We have a closer square. Sorry, I don't have the aspects turned on to Chiron. And then additionally, a sextile from this Jupiter to the south node here. So there's a very interesting tension here. This, by the way, I should also point out, this is the eclipse, the new moon eclipse in Virgo. And it looks like there's just some major conversations and events and developments relating to the use of force and power, the influence of authorities, a need for change in the way that we relate to each other, all like seeming to come together around this eclipse on the 21st of September. And additionally, it also just looks cool. It looks like a rocket ship. So, I mean, I don't know if there's going to be some sort of interesting launch around this period of time too. I would, at this point with astrology, I would not be surprised if this was literal in even that sense. But yeah, I don't know. This pattern here is just such a trip with how closely and tightly aligned all of these planets are. So that's the double Virgo new moon. Now, during Libra season, we're going to be dealing with kites. So whenever these personal planets move through here, again, there wasn't much else interesting that was going on this particular day, but we'll be having kites. So this minor grand trine is going to be then with the center point of Saturn and Neptune in opposition to the planets as they are moving around that Virgo into Libra area. When the sun moves through this area, we will probably see major heightened questions around leadership. Libra in and of itself tends to represent governance, leadership, business, and things like this in and of itself. But especially when the sun is around here, there's big questions around how someone is leading. So are you leading through hope for the future, or are you leading through fear of some outside group or some scary development or something like that? There would also be a rising with the oppositions between Libra and Aries, a focus on the consequence of war, the impact of diplomacy, the effectiveness of diplomacy, the legitimacy of war, and additionally, the legitimacy or lack thereof of the status quo authorities, especially with regard to how that authority is used. Is it used to otherize people? Is it used to bring balance? Is it used to bring peace or war? Is it making things better, basically? So these are going to be questions that come up for us every Libra season for a few years coming up. And additionally, I think it's interesting that in this Libra season coming up in 2025, that we still have all of the outer planets in the new signs and aligning in this way. And it just indicates so much to me that the general public are very ready for a new style of leadership. And I think it's going to take some effort to get us there, to get the leadership on board with the changes that people are wanting. Now, additionally, in this year, we have then the outer planets of Uranus and Neptune will be moving temporarily back into Taurus and Pisces. And so for this year, we will be getting this basket in Scorpio more than in Sagittarius. Now, when they're in these very early degrees of Sagittarius, it's still an orb. We can still call it that. But this particular new moon is aligning in a basket formation that's quite tight with these two outer planets, and it's not far off from Pluto either. Now, also this time, we also just happen to have Jupiter also here in these late degrees and in connection with all of these planets as well. And so now we have another castle. And what's interesting here is that I have the aspects turned on to not the node and Chiron, because I usually don't have those on, but everything else is only participating in this. This is all that's going on. Mars is more or less unaspected. It looks like it's pretty much at a T-square with the nodes, but in terms of other planets, it's not really in aspect to anything. Additionally, Venus is kind of standing on its own, just in a sextile to the south node and a trine to the north node, but not in connection really to the other planets. So this is also weird. You know, these are configurations that aren't at all typical. And this is the culmination of, this is building throughout this whole month. And one thing that we definitely need to keep in mind when we're looking at these things is to consider just how many aspects are just back to back to back to back to back. It's just one after the other, aspect, aspect, aspect. That's what the planets are not super used to doing in that tight of an alignment. And when we have these outer planets in this aspect pattern like this, and then especially when we have Jupiter's going to be moving in here, and then also as it moves into Leo, then these guys are going to move forward, and this basket's going to hold for a little while. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. But all of the planets from Jupiter through Pluto are then going to be almost instantaneous, straight up back-to-back aspects that the personal planets will be making all at once, and then they'll do this. They're going to be often also unaspected and just left alone, and then it's all at once. So we can definitely see like rushes of events, like everything happening at once, and then kind of quieting down a little bit again, and then everything happening all at once. And again, these kind of really discrete energies to each season. Now, this one trips me out for a couple reasons as well. We have not only a Mercury cazimi on the Scorpio new moon, but that Mercury is retrograde. So they're all of these are applying to each other, and they're like right on top of each other pretty much. Like that little dot there that's underneath is all of those lines there. And then this is where Venus is. Now, additionally, this new moon is ruled by Mars, which is unaspected. And that does seem to amplify some of the energy with regard to this new moon. I would expect for this to not be like the most comfortable here, but it's going to be interesting, and it's going to make sense at the very least after the fact that things kind of needed to fall in place this way. So this new moon and Mercury are all in opposition to Uranus here. And that's pretty shocking. So again, there could be like shocking information, shocking news. We could see something that has huge impact. So weird like indictments or charges brought against big people that we wouldn't expect, or events that just seem to unfold in ways that are like crazy, that could really impact even the functioning of certain systems, whether they be like governmental departments or literal networks or something like that. We could also see issues around, definitely potential issues around connectivity. And we could also see some serious like side taking in this, where there's one side against another side and people get like pretty wrapped up in that, for better or worse. And I would say on a personal level during this period of time to try not to invest too much faith into particular people, because they could prove around something like this to be unreliable, to fall through, like there was something else going on that you didn't know about. So I would just kind of throw that out there. And I also wouldn't, this would also be a time where I wouldn't super rely on networks to hold up. So, always keep saving your data. That's probably a good policy going forward with some of the transits that we're having. And additionally, something that's notable here is that Jupiter here is separating from pretty much everyone. It'll eventually have a quincunx here, but again, the closest thing that we're going to get is eventually in a little while it'll get a trine to this Venus, but it's not an aspect to it yet. So it's separating from everything, and it's retrograde. So it does seem to me like, again, people are probably lining up behind something in such a way where they might wind up changing their mind, either now or after something comes out. So that's just kind of a warning that I see with this, is that it's a bit of like a house of cards kind of situation here, where something just seems a little bit off, I mean, the opposition between Jupiter and Pluto is also pretty noteworthy, where Jupiter is like backing off of that aspect there. Jupiter in hard aspect to Pluto is also definitely not going to sweep under the rug any sort of abuses of power and things like that. So something along those lines could wind up coming out during this time, where something's coming out to where people who have lined up behind a certain person or ideology or group or whatever are kind of then needing to back off of it. And so I would just kind of keep this in mind. Again, it's always weird looking at these kinds of lineups when they're far in the future, because it's like, I have no idea what this is about, but the energy is just weirdly clear with a lot of the patterns that we're experiencing next year. So these are pretty much, I think, most of the things that I wanted to point out for this coming year of 2025. I'm going to do probably a few more videos on 2025, digging into it more. And then, of course, we're going to be looking at it as we move through all of it. But I wanted to focus in, at least at first, on some of the kind of discrete patterns that we're seeing throughout the seasons of the coming year, to point to some of the broader strokes of what we can expect to come out of the year collectively and personally. So, yeah, with all of that said, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate everyone who tuned in and for all of your support. Again, if you would like to see future videos like this, then do please subscribe. I would love to have you here for future videos. And if you don't mind hitting the thumbs up button, again, that helps me out so much. It helps the video to spread around. That's how the channel grows. And if there are people that you know are interested in stuff like this, or you would just like to share this video, that also helps me out a lot. And if you want to book a personal reading with me, there's also information in the description box. And all of these things, thumbs up, personal readings, subscribing, sharing, this all enables me to do this work. And so I am always and eternally like blown away and really grateful for all of that. So thank you all so much for your support. Additionally, we do have a Facebook group where we discuss transits and things like that, events that are going on in the world and how they play into the astrology. And there's also a link for that in the description box if you want to join there. But other than that, I hope you have an absolutely beautiful year, and I will be talking to you very soon. Bye.